Christmas Eve, 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 7 months. American soldiers are coming home. Families across the nation are celebrating their first peacetime Christmas in years. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, George and Jennie Sodder are preparing to celebrate with their 10 children in their 2-story home on the edge of town. George Sodder, born Giorgio Sodder in Sardinia, Italy, came to America in 1908 at the age of 13. He worked in the railroads, saved his money, and eventually started his own trucking business hauling dirt and coal. In 1922, he married Jennie Cipriani, herself the daughter of Italian immigrants. Together, they built a life in the hills of West Virginia. By 1945, they have 10 children, ranging in age from 2 to 23. Marion, the eldest at 23, is already married and living nearby. The other 9 children still live at home: John, 23, George Jr., 16, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, Betty, 5, and Sylvia, 3. The family is close-knit, hard-working, and by all accounts happy. George has strong opinions, particularly about Mussolini and fascism, which he openly criticizes in a community with a significant Italian immigrant population. Some believe his vocal anti-fascist stance may have made him enemies. But on this Christmas Eve, such concerns seem far away. December 24, 1945, begins as a day of preparation and anticipation. Jennie and the older children decorate the house. There are gifts to wrap, a meal to prepare, and the general chaos that comes with 9 children under one roof during the holidays. That evening, around 10 p.m., the family gathers in the living room. Marion stops by briefly to visit with her infant daughter. John and George Jr., the 2 oldest boys still at home, go into town. The younger children are eventually sent to bed, though some linger, too excited about Christmas morning to sleep. Maurice, 14, has been given permission to stay up late. He's been working on fixing up an old car, and tonight he's arranged to help a friend, probably talking about the vehicle they're working on, as teenage boys do. Around 10 p.m., a stranger appears at the door. The visitor is a life insurance salesman, or so he claims. It's an odd time for such a visit, especially on Christmas Eve. He asks to speak with George about his coverage. George, always practical, speaks with the man briefly. The conversation is unremarkable, or so it seems. The man leaves. But as he does, he makes a comment that will haunt Jennie Sodder for the rest of her life. Jennie Sodder said in an interview, said the man. He looked around at the children and said, "This is a nice place you have here. It would be a shame if anything happened to it." When he left, I saw him looking back at the house. By midnight, most of the family is asleep. George and Jennie go to bed around 12:30 a.m. Marion, the oldest daughter, is home with her own family. John and George Jr. are still out. Upstairs, 5 children are sleeping: Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, Betty, 5, and Sylvia, 3. Maurice is asleep on a couch downstairs. George Jr., 16, sleeps in the attic. The 2 youngest boys are also downstairs. At approximately 1 a.m., Jennie wakes to the sound of something hitting the roof. She describes it as a heavy object, followed by a rolling sound, as if something has fallen and is tumbling across the shingles. Then silence. Jennie lies in bed, listening. She hears nothing more and tries to go back to sleep. But at 1:30 a.m., the phone rings. The phone call is brief and strange. A woman's voice asks for someone who doesn't live at the house. In the background, Jennie hears laughter and the clinking of glasses, as if there's a party. She tells the woman she has the wrong number and hangs up. Wide awake now, she goes downstairs to check on things before returning to bed. Downstairs, she finds Maurice asleep on the couch. The lights are still on. The front door is unlocked. She turns off the lights, locks the door, and notices that the curtains are open and haven't been closed. She closes them. Then she goes back upstairs. At approximately 1:45 a.m., Jennie wakes again, this time to the smell of smoke and the unmistakable crackle of flames. Jennie said in an interview, "I woke up, and the room was filling with smoke. I shook George awake and screamed, "The house is on fire!" George leaps from bed and runs into the hallway. Flames are already consuming the center of the house. The fire is moving with terrifying speed. George and Jennie immediately begin waking the children. Maurice is downstairs on the couch. He wakes and escapes through the front door. George Jr. is in the attic. He climbs out of a window. But the 5 children upstairs, Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, and Sylvia, are trapped. George tries to reach them by climbing the stairs, but the flames drive him back. He runs outside to get a ladder that he keeps leaning against the house. The ladder is gone. It had been there just hours before, but now it's missing. Frantic, George tries to move one of his 2 coal trucks closer to the house so he can climb on top and reach the upstairs windows. Neither truck will start. Both vehicles had been in perfect working order earlier that day. By now, neighbors have seen the fire. They arrive but can do little. Someone tries to call the fire department. The operator doesn't answer. Another neighbor drives to the fire chief's home, 7 miles away, to alert him in person. The fire chief will later say he was never notified. He claims he didn't learn about the fire until the next morning, 8 hours after it started. When the fire department finally arrives, 7 hours after the fire began, the house has been reduced to ashes. As dawn breaks on Christmas morning, George and Jennie Sodder stand amid the ruins of their home. 4 of their children are accounted for, Maurice, George Jr., and the 2 youngest boys who had been sleeping downstairs. But 5 children are missing, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie, 8, Betty, 5, and Sylvia, 3. George begins to search through the ashes, desperate to find any trace of his children. The fire was intense, but there should be something, bones, teeth, anything. He finds nothing. The fire department conducts a brief search. They also find nothing. No human remains. No bones. Nothing. The official investigation is cursory at best. The fire chief and the county coroner arrive on the scene. Their conclusion is swift. The fire was caused by faulty electrical wiring, and the children's bodies were completely consumed by the flames. The fire chief said, "The fire burned so hot that it incinerated everything, including the bones." But George Sodder doesn't believe this. He's a trucking contractor. He understands fire. He knows that a house fire, even an intense one, doesn't burn hot enough to completely cremate human remains. Cremation requires sustained temperatures of over 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit. A house fire rarely exceeds 1,200 degrees, and even then, not consistently throughout the structure. Moreover, when the fire department finally arrived and extinguished the flames, they found household appliances, like the stove and refrigerator, still intact and recognizable. If the fire burned hot enough to completely destroy 5 bodies, how could these items survive? George Sodder also begins to remember strange occurrences from the weeks leading up to the fire. The ladder that went missing had been leaning against the house for months. The trucks that wouldn't start had been serviced recently, and were running perfectly just hours before the fire. And there was that insurance salesman who came to the door on Christmas Eve with his veiled threat. Then there are the sightings. In the weeks and months following the fire, people come forward claiming to have seen the Sodder children. A woman says she saw 4 of the children with 2 men and 2 women in a car stopped at a restaurant about 50 miles from Fayetteville early on Christmas morning, hours after the fire. A hotel owner reports seeing 4 children matching their descriptions in the company of adults who would not let them speak to anyone. George Sodder becomes convinced that his children did not die in the fire. He believes they were kidnapped. But why? And by whom? One theory centers on George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini and Italian fascism. In the years before the fire, George had been vocal in his opposition to Mussolini's regime, even as some members of the Italian immigrant community supported it. He'd had arguments. He'd received threats. 2 months before the fire, a man stopped by the house. He told George that his house would be burned and his children would be destroyed because of his outspoken views. At the time, George dismissed it as bluster. Now, standing in the ashes of his home, he wonders. George said. "Someone threatened me. Someone took my children." In the months following the fire, George hires private investigators. He offers rewards. He erects a billboard along Route 16 with photographs of the 5 missing children, asking for any information. The billboard will stand for decades, a haunting reminder of the family's unending search. Then, in 1949, 4 years after the fire, George decides to excavate the site where the house once stood. He brings in equipment to dig deep into the foundation. And there, buried several feet underground, workers find something: small fragments of bone and what appears to be internal organs preserved in a mass. George sends the remains to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The report comes back: the bones belong to a male, aged 16 to 22. Not a child. The remains also show no signs of fire damage, suggesting they were buried after the fire, not during it. The discovery raises more questions than it answers. Whose remains are these? Why were they buried at the site? Were they planted to end the investigation? The years pass. George and Jennie never stop searching. They follow every lead, no matter how unlikely. They travel hundreds of miles to investigate sightings. They maintain the billboard. They refuse to give up hope. Then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, Jennie receives a letter. It's postmarked from Kentucky, but there's no return address. Inside is a photograph of a young man in his 20s, with dark hair and a serious expression. On the back, someone has written a single name: Louis Sodder. Louis was 9 years old the night of the fire. If he survived, he would now be 32, exactly the age of the man in the photograph. Jennie is convinced it's her son. The resemblance is striking. But who sent the letter? And why now, after more than 2 decades? George hires a private detective to travel to Kentucky and investigate. The detective takes the photograph, cashes George's check, and disappears. He's never heard from again. The photograph is never returned. The lead goes cold. George Sodder dies in 1969, 1 year after receiving the mysterious photograph. He dies without answers, never knowing what happened to his 5 children. Jennie lives until 1989. She, too, dies without ever learning the truth. The Sodder children mystery remains one of America's most enduring unsolved cases. Over the decades, theories have proliferated. Some believe the children died in the fire, and the official explanation is correct, despite the lack of remains. Others are convinced they were kidnapped, possibly as retaliation for George's anti-fascist views, or as part of some other sinister plot. There are those who believe the children were taken to Italy, or hidden in the Italian-American community. Some suggest connections to organized crime. Others point to inconsistencies in witness statements and the behavior of local authorities. Why did the fire department take 7 hours to arrive? Why was the investigation so brief? Why were the remains found in 1949 never properly explained? The 4 surviving Sodder children, Maurice, Martha, George Jr., and John, never stopped searching for their siblings. They maintained the billboard for years. They followed every lead. They fought to keep the case alive in the public consciousness. In 2013, one of the surviving siblings told a reporter that the family had received tips over the years suggesting the children had been taken to Italy, or were living in the American South. None could be confirmed. The surviving Sodder children have now passed away, taking their memories of that terrible Christmas Eve with them. The site where the Sodder home once stood is now empty. The billboard was taken down in the 1980s. But the questions remain. What happened to Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, and Sylvia Sodder on Christmas Eve, 1945? Did they perish in the flames, their bodies somehow completely destroyed? Or were they taken, spirited away in the night, to live out their lives somewhere else, perhaps never knowing who they really were? On Christmas Eve, 1945, 5 children went to bed in their home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, dreaming of the presents they would open in the morning. They never got that chance. Whether they died in the fire or were taken, their loss devastated a family and created a mystery that has haunted investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths for nearly 80 years. George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives searching for answers. They refused to believe their children were gone. They refused to give up hope. Perhaps, in some small way, that hope was a gift, a way to keep their children alive in their hearts, even when the world insisted they were lost. This Christmas, as we gather with our own families, spare a thought for the Sodders, for George and Jennie, who lost everything on what should have been the most joyful night of the year, and for Martha, Louis, Jennie, Betty, and Sylvia, 5 children whose fate remains unknown.